All right, I got a fun project today. I've got the silicone mold here that I've already pre-poured a very thin layer of epoxy on the bottom the other day. It's nice and hard. I've got some popcorn that I freshly popped, and we're gonna make a popcorn epoxy serving tray. Why? Because we can. Let me try that again. Oh, okay, so let's do this. First things first, like I said, I poured a couple days ago my bottom layer of epoxy so that my popcorn will be cast inside. We don't want to put the popcorn on the bottom of the mold, obviously, because then it's going to be on the bottom when you release it from the mold, and you don't want that. You want it cast inside. So I've got my very thin bottom layer. Let's get the popcorn in to the tray. Okay, so I've got all my popcorn in. I've got it set up the way I like it. It's important to leave yourself a little bit of space around the perimeter so that when you pour your epoxy, again, you're not having whatever it is you're casting sticking out of the edge of the epoxy. This way you'll get a nice full seal cast inside. And now here's the other important part. When you're doing casting like this, what I like to do, especially if it's something light that's going to possibly float, and trust me, I've learned that the hard way in past projects, you want to do a very light coat over top of everything just to harden it up and get it stuck down onto your base layer. So that's where a difference in epoxy is going to come in. I'm using two types of epoxy here. I'm using a deep pour system, and I'm using a bar and tabletop system. Two different types of epoxy, two different reasons for using them. Now the deep pour, I could use it. It's going to take an awful lot of time to cure up and set up hard enough for me to be able to do my final pour over top. So I'm going to go with a bar and table. It's meant for just very thin coats, like a 1/4 inch at a time. And that's perfect for what I want to do here and get all my popcorn hardened up and tacked down. So when I do my big deep pour coat, it's not all going to start floating up to the top. But that's enough talking. Let's mix up this bar and table and get our first thin layer coat on here. I like to use Varathane epoxy. Both their deep pour and bar and table formulas are easy to work with and always give me good results. I'm pouring my thin layer of bar and table, which I've already mixed at a 1-to-1 ratio of resin to hardener. This is often the mix ratio for bar and table formulas, but if you're using a different brand, you should always double check the instructions just to be sure. All right, perfect. I let my little hold down pour with the bar and table cure overnight, and everything is nicely hardened up. The popcorn's not going to float now when I do my casting pour, so we can get to that. Now that we're ready for our big casting pour, we're going to be switching over to Varathane's deep pour formula, which is mixed at a 2-to-1 ratio of epoxy to hardener. Again, be sure to double check the correct mixing ratios for the epoxy you're using because it's critical to the curing process. If you throw off the mixing ratio by pouring too much or too little of one of the parts, you're not going to get a proper cure. And we all know that epoxy isn't cheap, so you don't want to be having to start all over. It's also very important to make sure the resin and hardener are thoroughly mixed, so don't be impatient here. Mix, and then when you think you've got it really well mixed, mix a little more. Now we can finally get to the fun part and pour our casting layer until all of our popcorn is fully submerged. Then comes the boring part. Most deep pour epoxies take between 48 and 72 hours to cure, so make sure you've got something else to do that'll keep you from the temptation to demold your project too soon. Once your epoxy is fully cured, you can finally go ahead and pull it out of the mold. I'm using a silicone mold here, which, as you can see, is incredibly easy to remove, but they are a bit more expensive than the polypropylene molds, which work just as well and just need a few taps of a mallet to separate your project from the mold. To finish off the board, I went ahead and added a slight chamfered edge to all sides. This definitely isn't necessary, but it adds some nice dimension to the finished product. And just like that, we have ourselves an epoxy popcorn serving board. If you've been curious about epoxy but have felt intimidated, I hope that this video helped show you that it's really not that scary and gave you the confidence to take on a project of your own. And all of this popcorn talk made me hungry, so I think I'm going to go and pop a fresh bag.